Hi, my name's Timothy Mahoney. People who know me call me Tim. I work for IKEA, for IKEA Retail. This talk is called The Return of What We Talk About When We Talk About Observability Frameworks. It's a follow-up to a talk that I gave at Monotrama in 2023, which had to do with observability frameworks. Who am I? I'm a senior systems engineer at Ingka, which is the IKEA Retail. I work in the observability enablement team. So I'm helping other teams. We have 200,000 some people that work at IKEA. We have thousands of teams, and they all need help with observability. So that's what my team is mostly responsible for. The title I'm trying to be clever with. It's kind of an homage to Haruki Murakami's What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, which actually turns out to be an homage to Raymond Carver's What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And I love observability, so I thought it was a good match. So where did this all start? I started out working at IKEA with log analytics, and this problem started even before then. As an organization, we started to think about what sort of things we were doing with observability and how we were going to drive observability adoption. The big problems that we had, that our tooling was dependent on, or our observability was dependent on tooling, and it was dependent on vendors. And we really wanted to have something that was matched more what our organizational needs were than what our vendors were telling us they could provide. We had issues with consistency with the events that we were generating. We definitely had lineage and ownership issues. I know teams would trade ingest tokens around like Pokemon cards, and data would end up in the wrong place, and no one seems to know who owned it or who was responsible for it. We also had taxonomy issues when we talk about observability, we talk about monitoring, we talk about frameworks. People had different ideas and expectations of what that meant. And we had conflicting standards and requirements. Some would say that everything should be logs and the logs should exist in a certain place. Other things said that we were tools that we were mandated to use or not mandated to use, or they were optional to use. So we really needed clarity in our organization to try and solve those problems. The goal for my team when we started was to build an observability framework that was primarily tool agnostic, so we could take this framework and change the underlying tooling without creating a bunch of problems and load for our developers. We wanted to embrace open source. I think open source is fantastic, and I really like to get involved in open source projects whenever possible. We wanted to lower the cognitive load for our engineers so they didn't have to think about making these decisions, that we would help them with paved paths basically to get their observability started and do it in an Ingka specific way. And we really wanted to encourage collaboration both within the organization and maybe be able to contribute back to open source ourselves. So when we started the idea of a framework, we had to do the groundwork on it. And a friend of mine named Magnus Lord, he suggested that we be constructively lazy. And I think that's a great idea. What we really wanted to do is not come up with a bunch of cognitive overload for our engineers. If we design something that's really complicated for them to understand, they aren't going to be able to ingest that. They aren't going to be able to take that and do anything constructive with it. They're just going to think this is too much for us. We didn't want to create a bunch of documentational debt that we wouldn't be able to maintain. It's not very constructive to have, pages in GitHub or in Confluence that are ancient that people are looking at, because they're not going to trust that that's what's actually going on right now, or what's current, or what they should be doing. We didn't want to own a bunch of technical debt. We didn't have a big team, so we couldn't really afford to sit there with a bunch of things that we had to constantly maintain. We wouldn't be able to do our enablement work. We wouldn't be able to help people actually solve their problems. So we had contributors to building the framework. Luckily, I work in a team that has a really great group of people that are really motivated, that really like to solve problems, and are really like to talk and share their experiences. So that really helped get the ball rolling. We have luckily a small community that we've started. Well, not small, it's a growing community. of people who work at IKEA that want to contribute to doing good observability and want to learn from other teams. So we have our Slack channel. We are fortunate enough to do workshops, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We like to get involved in the forums that are available online and go to conferences and learn from other companies' experience and other users and other developers' experience when it comes to observability. Um, Unfortunately, the downside of this was the detractors. Early on, as we started to try and uh, come up with ideas of how this framework might look and how we might help people, we found that a lot of engineers might not have time or interest in being involved in it or giving feedback that was valuable to us. So we kind of ran into the dumpster fire emoji. You come with an idea of how you might help somebody, and they come back with a dumpster fire emoji, and that's the only response you get. It's not very constructive, but it was something we had to consider that, since this wasn't the way things work here, is that the change wasn't necessarily mandated. It was something that we had to offer and get people to buy into. The risk was that some of the engineers might reply negatively, like to what we're suggesting. It's not saying that that's part of company culture, but it was definitely a risk, and it definitely triggered some reactions within our team. Um, what what it really did was had me at us face the what do you call it now? We had to face our what's it called? The imposter syndrome. When it came to things like that, that we had to make sure that we were an authority on stuff and felt comfortable talking about it, even if the reaction was negative. So one of the things we did when we kind of wanted to take on as a team what was our responsibility for building this and where would we start with it was we really wanted to think about what were we talking about, so we knew that we weren't mixing up terminology, that we had a very clear goal in mind, and we could differentiate what the components of this framework would look like. So we were talking about an observability model, a data standard. We really wanted to make sure that we understood the concepts completely and we didn't make assumptions on them. And we weren't afraid to ask trivial questions of stuff. And most importantly, what did our users actually want us to provide them? The other problem that we came across right quickly was are we being understood in what we're conveying to the users? And there's a lot of problems. I know just off the top of my head that there's about 10 native language or 10 different languages that engineers I work with every day speak natively. So English isn't their native language. English is our business language, but it creates a language barrier when you're creating documentation or guidelines for people if they're not easily understood. So we had to think about using modal verbs. We had to think about RFC 2119s for your shoulds, musts, mays, and we had to understand that vocabulary wasn't the same as authority. That we noticed in a lot of the documentation and things that people had shared that sometimes they would try and use really complicated words to give themselves a sense of authority, but what they were doing is just basically creating confusion. They present something to a team of engineers and not get a response simply because the engineers never understood what they said. Other thing, and this is my pet peeve, is that we didn't use ChatGPT to write all this. It's very good to help brainstorm on writing good content for something, but it's definitely not a good use case to just rely on it to generate text for you. If you don't understand it, no one else will either. So we had to think about, for this framework, how and where would we collaborate on it? Since we wanted a collaborative effort on this, we wanted people to have feedback on the things that we were proposing. We really need to think about how that would look and where that best took place. If that should be in Git, where people could create issues on it or do pull requests to make changes to it, or if that belonged in Confluence, which we were using for business documentation. And we had to set roles for those two things to say that like Confluence would maybe describe our way of working to other teams and where to find the information, but the real information and the chain of decisions that went around building the framework and how it was commented on and how decisions were made will all be put in Git. Creating a community around it, though, was critical to get that feedback to make sure that what we were doing was fit for purpose. Then we had to ask ourselves if we really needed a framework. What was the purpose in doing it? Was it just an exercise and provide making ourselves self-important, or were we actually solving a problem? What we found is that engineers are going to solve a problem that's here and now. So their problem was observability, and maybe they didn't know where the tooling was, maybe they didn't know how they were meant to use it, and they would go off and create solutions for things that they thought didn't exist within the organization. So it was really important for that framework to be in place to help guide them into making good decisions. We also wanted to prevent tool sprawl. Like if there's a team that runs observability tooling for the entire organization, it's no purpose in someone spinning up their own Grafana stack or Elk stack just to solve their problem when they could just let someone else run that software for them. And we wanted to fill in the knowledge gaps that sometimes people didn't understand, that there were solutions to their problems that existed within our tooling, or ways that we could help enable them to solve a problem. So the framework played a really big important role. So we love OpenTelemetry. I think since I joined this team I'm in now, I really didn't know what it was when I left the world of Splunk, and it was a pretty new idea, but we've really come to embrace it in our team. It really plays an important role in how we could remain tool agnostic and build this observability framework. We specifically are, using the data model extensively internally. It comes with all these great things like specifications, the components, the OTEPs. You have all this information and decisions on why things are the way they are in OpenTelemetry from the beginning. And it's a really nice way of conveying that to the rest of the organization and saying, like, we've made our decision to follow this because it's open, and we can adopt it very easily, and we can use it to suit in a way that suits our needs, and our tooling vendors will support it. So we started thinking about the components that would make up our framework. We started with OpenTelemetry components because they're readily available, like the data model and OTLP, super important, and that we came with components like the OTel collector that we could deploy instead of relying on tool-specific ingestion. Then when it came to IKEA-specific things, we could build those for our organization and just base them on OpenTelemetry, and it made that aspect of it very easy to manage. Standards, when it came to our framework, it's a little difficult because CNCF is not a standards institution. So we had to say what was the standard for Ingka. We defined that all in ADR, so people understood, like, this is what the observability standard is for Ingka. And we based it on a common industry standard. Probably the most important part in the framework was the data model. It would ensure enterprise-wide consistency in our observability signals, which is something we didn't have before, and it allowed for unambiguous mapping between different pieces of our infrastructure, whether it was stuff that runs on-prem, stuff that runs in the cloud. We had a very unambiguous mapping between values of events, and that way we could easily correlate them. So we had to think about, with the data model, what was the minimum viable set of attributes for an atomic unit of observability. So we started with ours defining attributes, and they started to evolve over time. But things like deployment environment, service version, domain, legal company, subdomain, system name, team name, framework version, these are all correlatable to real world things. We could tie them into things like our system catalogs. We could tie them into business glossary, and they allow us to slice and dice up our observability data to suit many different needs. So great, we have this framework. We come up with these attributes that we want everyone to use. We tell them they need to use OpenTelemetry for all of their stuff. How do we ensure that these teams start adopting OpenTelemetry for all of the applications we have? I think, well, we definitely have to start off by showing them how that we solve problems for them using the tooling that we have available and using OpenTelemetry. They really want to be shown solutions over possibilities. Like, yeah, you could instrument that. They're not so interested, but if you show that where someone's instrumented code with OpenTelemetry, they're sending events and they're solving their problems, they're going to jump on board and want to be part of that. You have to show that it's a clear benefit to teams and company with the framework attributes. Sometimes it's not always understood that for a team that their application is important in a greater context, that they need to add data that tells us what team that data runs that, what application it is, if it's development or not. The ownership of the data is super important. We don't know whose data it is unless they put their name on it, basically, or we at least need to ensure that. And company level attributes, a lot of teams don't understand that when they generate observability data, it's business data. It belongs to the business, not necessarily just to the team. So what we've done to absolutely ensure adoption is that when we do ingest events into our tooling, we've created filters that don't allow events that are missing attributes to be ingested. So it's very clear right from the beginning, if you're sending data to the tooling and you haven't filled out the attributes and followed the framework correctly, the events won't show up in the tooling. Another thing that becomes super important is examples. If someone needs to instrument code or solve a problem, it's less time consuming to share examples with them and have them follow through with those than it is to help individual teams every time. So we gave teams a place to collaborate and share examples in our Slack channel, for example, in our Git repo. And we also have an observability day where we share information, so teams are allowed to show what they've solved with observability and how they solved it. We definitely make sure that we include our framework examples and all and attributes in all the examples, so that when teams do copy paste examples from our repo, they get the framework attributes as well. Demos and labs are super important as well. Demonstrates teams how to use observability and the framework and how it will solve their problems. We've had programs like Native Clouders, which I was part of, where we trained, I think, something in the neighborhood of 300 engineers in cloud native ways of working, and observability was part of that. And I was lucky enough to be part of that and build the lab around that. So we taught distributed tracing to a bunch of new engineers and a bunch of existing engineers. But that's a really great way within an organization, especially if you have an enablement team, to reach a lot of people, to help them understand the potential of what they could do and get some time hands-on with that. So where are we heading with observability at Ingka now that we have this great framework in place? So we have engineering baseline. It's an effort outside of what our team was working on, but it's all the engineers together in Ingka have come up with this. Within IKEA have come up with this great engineering baseline, which has basic practices and shows people the different steps that they should do, like infrastructure as code or security practices, incident management, things like that. And we're responsible for the one that has to do with observability and monitoring, or we contribute very heavily to it. I think my colleagues that created our engineering baseline were very, very smart and said that observability should be a practice and not a checkbox. So we're teaching teams about how they should start from learning how to do observability to practicing it to leading in it, if that's what they see fit. But it wasn't like a checkbox that they could just say, I'm sending traces, check, that's done. It's more that they understand what the process is of it. That's engineering practice and not a checkbox. The challenges we find trying to implement our framework and work with our engineering baseline with observability monitoring, bot services and software as a service is very difficult to work with because those requirements were never put forward in the beginning of what that signal should look like from those vendors when they're working with us. So we are kind of working towards how we extend our observability framework to deal with bot services and SaaS, and how should they send telemetry signals to us so we can consume them and have an idea of what's going on in our systems. Adopting a consistent event structure is very difficult. We have a lot of legacy systems that have been with us for a long time. How are they going to change, or how can we help them send those framework attributes with their events, or start to adopt OpenTelemetry and things that have been running for some time? Front-end observability is a big topic lately, and privacy as well when it comes to that sort of observability. How do we find out things that are happening on the front end? How do we do it in a way that's not leaking privacy information out to places it doesn't belong? So that's becoming a big topic for us, and dealing with legacy systems as well. Like we have a lot of things that have been running our organization for a long time. How are we going to instrument those? How are we going to help those teams get a modern observability? So the next step too, since we have all these great attributes that we work with, that we've added to our observability data with this framework, how are we going to use those outside of observability? How are we going to think with a product mindset about that? So we start thinking about observability as a data product. Since we have all these attributes that are tied to external business use cases like business glossary or system master catalog, that we can slice and dice this observability data. We can start to look at like how do they correlate to other business data, and we can make them available to be shared as a data product. So teams that are stakeholders, for example, have access to the data that comes from the observability, not necessarily dependent on the observability tooling. So when we come to doing that, the next question is like we have to have some idea of the quality of the data that we're providing as well. So we start thinking about how are we going to implement data observability. We've done some experiments with open metadata and started to look at like when we talk about our observability data, how fresh is it? What quality is the events that we get in? What value do they have? We look at schema and schema changes, which is super important for people who are consuming other people's events. Like if the schema changes on those events, does that break their dashboards and their alerting? And we think about the lineage of the data. Where is this data coming from? How is it traveling through systems, and how long is it taking to get to those places? Yeah, so in conclusion, yeah, make the framework something your teams want to adopt is really important. Make sure that it shows a valid use case. It helps them. They see problems getting solved, and they see that their data then helps other teams as well. Ensure that your consumers are invested in collaboration. We are a small observability team. We're not that many people in our team, I think. It would be really difficult for us to go for everybody, but if everyone collaboratively helps solve observability problems, it's easier for the entire organization. Don't present your case in a way that can be easily dismissed in an emoji is also super important. Sometimes you have to sell the idea to a team that thinks that they don't need to do any changes, or they don't feel like making any changes, or it's not a priority. Maybe be a little compassionate to teams when they have high cognitive load or problems that they might not always have observability as their first thought. And definitely face your imposter syndrome. If there's anything I learned from doing the Data Clouders program and our engineering baseline work, is that it's okay to ask silly questions, and it's definitely good to have a clear understanding of everything, and understand that everyone has a small piece of that big puzzle, but no one has the whole puzzle. That's it. Thanks for me.